ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for the invite here to talk today. I'm going to talk to you about the British leaving. As you can see, this guy is running as fast as he can to get out. During the Irish War of Independence, there were about 57,000 British soldiers stationed throughout the country. The army consisted of 2,100 officers, 54,800 other ranks. And also, of interest, there were 23,400 horses as well within the country. These were all part of 3 divisions that were in action against the Irish Republican Army at that particular time. With the signing of the treaty and its subsequent ratifications, the final withdrawal of British troops from the 26 counties of Southern Ireland commenced on the 16th of January 1922. The Duke of Wellington Regiment were the first to leave Ireland via Dublin Port on the 20th of January 1922. So things were happening fairly quick. However, a few days before this, the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary were demobilised. As per the treaty, this unit was prioritised due to their ruthless efficiency during the War of Independence. On the 13th of January, the auxiliaries were demobilised in the steamer SS Galtimore, berthed at Holyhead, which had been temporarily converted into a floating barracks. A sergeant and 12 constables were detailed to process the officers, which involved disarming them and supplying them with civilian attire, and they wanted them out of the country as quick as possible. The British mandate in Palestine was noted as a possible destination for some of the force. The army were soon to follow suit. The evacuation of the military was to take place in 3 phases. Phase 1 was troops surplus to requirements in the cities of Dublin, Cork and the Curragh Army Camp were to be evacuated. The remaining troops stationed in Cork and the Curragh were then to be pulled out. And the final phase was the evacuation of military personnel from Dublin. While soldiers and equipment were moved through other ports, Dublin was designated as the main embarkation port as the national rail network was centred on the city with a large number of routes into the port area. A railway office was opened to facilitate the military and ships were chartered from local steamship companies. And you can see here, this is General Macready, the man who was actually pulling out the last Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in Ireland. This is Dublin Harbour, a map of the port here, and you can actually see it's actually quite large, like a little city within a city. Within the port itself, the Army and the Navy had taken complete control of the North Wall extension and parts of the Alexandra Basin. They had established this control during World War I, and it was organised like an army barracks, as this was the main transport area into and out of the country at the time. The decision to concentrate the withdrawal at Cork and the Curragh was that British command wanted to avoid leaving units at potential flashpoints such as Limerick and Tralee. They did not want to be called in as an aid to civil power if law and order collapsed under Free State rule. And as Liz mentioned there earlier, there was an awful lot of trouble actually happening as the British were trying to pull out. General Macready, who was Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in Ireland, was very aware of the political situation in Ireland and that it could deteriorate rapidly if the treaty was rejected in an election that could possibly lead to the Civil War, which it actually did. He had by mid-February of 1922 decided that if the tide turned, he could sideline the provisional government, declare martial law and seize key infrastructure. Now, this all depended on what resources he had at his disposal at the time because the British had been constantly pulling out bit by bit. He opposed postponing the withdrawal of his troops, even though by the end of February he had concluded that civil war was likely, as tensions arising from the treaty split became more evident. Macready did suspend his withdrawal for a short time during the summer of 1922 until the provisional government took action against Republican forces throughout the country. The only exceptions of military units staying with Ireland were the 6 infantry battalions that were to become the Northern Ireland Garrison. These were the 1st Battalion, the Warwickshire Regiment, the 1st Battalion, the Royal Sussex Regiment, the 1st Battalion, the Essex Regiment, the 1st Battalion, the Lincolnshire Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, the East Lancashire Regiment, and the 4th Worcester Regiment. The logistics of the withdrawal was an enormous undertaking, which was extensively covered in the national press. There were 85 properties in the 26 counties and 14 in Northern Ireland. These included all the military barracks, the Royal Hospital at Kilmainham, firing ranges, 4 hospitals, an artillery range in Wicklow, airports and coastal forts. As barracks were closed throughout the country, Dublin City Corporation actively considered using those in Dublin as temporary accommodation to alleviate the problem of the city's slums. Cavalry units were forced to go out before the infantry, and units that were to be drafted for overseas service, like in Germany, India, and Egypt, were all to be given priority. Huge amounts of military stores were transported to the docklands under armed guards to be shipped back to England. You can see them all here loading up. A lot of some of the crane operators got overtime as well to packing the ships up. The threat of attack, though, from Republican forces was ever present, and armed troops were on alert as convoys of military stores were taken to secure locations and then transported to England. The train ferry number 2 and the Sir Redvers Buller were ships used to move equipment and stores to Liverpool and Holyhead in Wales. By December 1922, there were only about 5,000 troops left in Dublin under the command of General Macready. At the end of November, the War Office had notified Irish Command that the final phase of evacuation was to commence on the 14th of December 1922, and that the final date to be out was the 17th of December, today 100 years ago. Termination notices were given to civilian staff in Ireland. An office for the clearing up of General Headquarters Ireland was established at Hounslow Barracks in England. A clerk was employed to process the tons of equipment and supplies that would be returning to the military. In November 1922, a memorial service was held at the Royal Hospital Commemorations, a retirement home for veterans and also the residency of the Commander-in-Chief of the British Forces in Ireland, who was General Macready. This service was to commemorate the officers and ranks that had died on service in Ireland. Soldiers then heading to the docks were ordered to carry their personal kit, 50 rounds of ammunition, their weapons and 2 blankets. An order issue stated that when moving, troops were to carry all small arms and ammunition on their person at all times. The theft of weapons and ammunition was still a threat to Crown forces, even as they prepared to pull out. On the 13th of December, the torpedo boat HMS Venomous arrived at the North Wall to provide protection for the troops. The first to leave were the sick and wounded soldiers. The 14th of December saw the military staff of the Viceregal Lodge and the Chief Secretary's lodges leave, and troops from Richmond and Island Bridge Barracks evacuate. The ordnance and remount depots were also handed over and vacated on the 14th of December. The Royal Air Force personnel stationed at the emergency airstrip in the Phoenix Park were also pulled out that day, as were a group of nurses from King George V Hospital, all being sent by road to Northern Ireland. Armoured cars and other transports like that also headed northwise. Troops continuously made their way to the docklands, where they boarded ships to take them to England. The North Dublin Workhouse and the Royal Hibernian Military School were also vacated and handed over, all personnel moving to their embarkation points at the docklands. The evacuation of naval personnel was completed on the 16th of December with the departure of Rear Admiral C.H. Fox, the naval officer commanding on land in the Kingstown Naval Area. As British command in Ireland was being dissolved, General Neville Macready inspected a parade of old soldiers at the Royal Hospital Commemorations and formally bid them farewell. They would continue to reside at the hospital until 1927. Now, this is an interesting little sideline. It is interesting to note that, like many British military installations throughout Ireland, the flagpole at the RHK, and you can see it here, was purposely broken. This occurred at many barracks and military buildings throughout the country as the British withdrew. This had been reported in the press as, on evacuating a military installation, the removal or destruction of flagpoles was a long British Army tradition. Now, this is one of the first times that Britain has actually left one of the countries that they had occupied for many, many years. So I contacted British military archives and things like that. They never heard of it before, so it might have been done just locally here in Ireland. The 17th of December saw General Macready leaving the Royal Hospital, his residence. He inspected the 2nd Battalion of the Worcester Regiment that were in a hutted camp at the Royal Hospital Commemorations. Now, if you know the area, all of Military Road, at that particular area where they're building the new Garda Detective Unit headquarters there, that was all the hutted encampment all along there. He then went to the quays and took to the salute of 3,000 troops from the Royal Barracks as they pulled out and made their way along the North Quays to Dublin Port. There's once again the square in the Royal Hospital Commemorations and Macready there viewing the Worcester Regiment at the time. 10 o'clock in the morning, the evacuation began. Also on that day, the magazine fort, the shell factory, the Royal Hospital, General Headquarters, King George V Hospital, the RIC Depot, Arbour Hill, Marlborough and the Royal Barracks were all vacated and handed over. The advance guard to the Docklands was provided by the Leicestershire Regiment with their colours uncased, accompanied by a military band. Large crowds gathered along the route to watch the military depart. The route was secured by Free State troops who patrolled in armoured cars and provided a flanking and rear guard. General Macready made his way to Kingstown and embarked on the light cruiser HMS Dragon that sailed at 3:15 p.m. Once out at sea, the ship met with HMS Wolseley and HMS Venomous, which had been lying off Howth. They had been protecting the steamers which were carrying the troops and equipment from Dublin Port. Lieutenant, who was acting captain, Henry Robinson, Chief Embarkation Officer, and Captain Shepherd, who was assisting him, were the last British officers to cross the gangway and sail on the last troop ship, the Arvonia, from the Alexandria Basin at 3:45 p.m. that afternoon. The Evening Herald reported, "Today, a row of cold and empty cookers standing in a line at the Alexandria Basin premises. Some handed over hutments, small flags, trampled into the mud, and some floating flotsam and jetsam are the sole reminders of the departing troops." The final entry in the Irish Command War Diary for that day read, "The evacuation of Dublin was completed without any interference from the Republicans." It's of interest to note that many of the evacuations over the 12 months of 1922 were very large affairs, often with military ceremonials. They were not met with hostilities as one would expect, but many of the inhabitants had watched the British military go with apprehension. For centuries, the British military had been present in Ireland with a network of barracks throughout the towns and cities. Locals were recruited, and others stationed throughout Ireland had married and settled into the localities. The military had been woven into the socio-economic fabric of Irish society. On walking around Dublin, General Macready noted, "From what I saw when strolling through the town, a general air of depression seemed to have settled on the place. No demonstrations, no music or occasional revolver shots, no flags, except a few whitish-looking bits of bunting that once displayed the green, yellow and white national colours, but had become washed out by the rain and the sun." Within a matter of months, days, hours and minutes, the British Army that had been a presence in Ireland for centuries had withdrawn from the 26 counties. The withdrawal was to have an impact on the population's everyday life, and an uncertainty for the future prevailed. And what of the British Tommy leaving Ireland, the ordinary soldier? Many had been stationed in the country during the War of Independence and had taken an active part in the counterinsurgency. The guerrilla warfare waged by the Irish Republican Army during this period inflicted many casualties on both the military and the police. The psychological effect on those that managed to leave the country was huge, with many suffering from what we know now as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Major General Douglas Wimberley wrote, "Soon after the armistice or truce in Ireland, we of the Camerons were ordered back to Aldershot, and I do not think a single officer or man was sorry to leave the so-called Emerald Isle behind us. Once more, we were back in peacetime soldiering. But after the Great War, North Russia, and then Southern Ireland, I had got so used to sleeping with a loaded pistol under my pillow, I found it quite difficult to drop the habit for many a month to come." Though the conflict had ended, others were about to commence. Ireland will be thrown into a bloody turmoil, its lasting legacy still evident today. So thank you all very much.